welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me as ever is Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshall, and joining us today is Julia Thomas. Hello everyone.
Hello.
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 Julia, heavy metal isn't your day job. You're finishing your thesis, aren't you? Could you tell us about what it is and where you sit as a First World War historian?
Finishing is a very kind word. I'm nowhere near finishing it. I'm actually an anthropologist, and my interest in warfare started with an interest about the stories we tell and how do we tell stories and how do we signify warfare. And then I realised that I needed to get a master's in history, which is what I did. And I wanted to compare British and French poetry of the First World War. And when I got to France, my supervisor told me, you can't do that because French poetry of the First World War doesn't exist. So I finished my own master's with him. And that was a very good point because he was the one who pushed me towards getting a doctorate in French literature. So I started off as an anthropologist, then I went into history, and now my thesis is in French literature because his point was that I actually had to build the corpus before I could use it as a historical source or as a source for the anthropology of combat. So I'm currently doing a thesis on French poetry of the First World War, both building a corpus and then trying to use it as a historical source to understand how people told stories about their experience under fire.
I think a whole generation of historians are going to be very thankful for that corpus you're building at the moment.
It's a bit of a nightmare, really, but hopefully that will contribute to the debate. It's slow work, so lots of database building.
So, Julia, where do we want to start with heavy metal? Is there a tradition of the First World War as a theme in heavy metal music?
I think it's more of a tradition of war in general, isn't it? I mean, Black Sabbath, who are credited with inventing the genre, used their imagery of the occult to denounce the Vietnam War. War Pigs has become an anthem for everyone who's actually into heavy metal. So I think there has always been this relationship between heavy metal and warfare, and I can't quite put my finger on where it comes from. Is it because it's a genre dedicated to people who feel excluded from the society and therefore have more intimate relationships with violence, or is it because just of the way heavy metal sounds and therefore the music would be more prone to expressing warfare? So I think that the relationship is between heavy metal and warfare in general, and then you get into the First World War, which is actually not that represented in the whole corpus. I think I was reading, I think it's the Heavy Metal Archive, and they say that only 5% of bands have warfare as a central theme. And then I was reading this master's dissertation by a French student called Alexandre Roussel. He did his master's dissertation with Nicolas Beaupré and Stéphane Lebras about the representations of the First World War in heavy metal. And this whole thing about heavy metal concentrating on the Second World War comes from his dissertation. But there's an online metal archive, and there's something called Encyclopedia Metallum, I think, where they have bands and general themes. There's even, if I'm not mistaken, a master's program dedicated to heavy metal studies in Finland, but don't quote me on that.
I'm so pleased that there's firstly a heavy metal archive and also that it's online, because I was just imagining me turning up to like a physical archive and then being at the day being like, no. Just take your yellow satchel and your stupid yellow jumper and go home.
Heavy metal rules the world, so it had to be online.
That's true.
If we're looking at internationalism, do bands from different countries draw upon different themes of the war which reflect the band's nationality?
I'm not a musician myself, so I don't really go into the musical aspect of it, but most of us who have grown up on heavy metal and who like the genre can tell if we're listening to a band that either comes from or has been influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal, if it's an American band that has been influenced either by the hard rock, glam, hair metal aspect of it, or by the Big Four and the thrash metal aspect of it, or one of the new German power metal bands. So there are themes in the way they play. In terms of warfare, I think that, well, definitely Iron Maiden digs and looks into national myth for most of their music, not just the First World War. I don't know any German bands, for example, who talk about the First World War. There certainly are German bands, and Alexander Husserl does talk about them in his master's dissertation. But the thing is, I'm very conservative with regards to what I listen to. So if it wasn't around in the 80s, I don't like it. If it wasn't transmitted by my parents to me, then I don't like it. I'm not one of those people who are always discovering new bands.
I do get a sense that there are particular stories or myths of the First World War that get picked up by these bands, because you set us some homework, and heavy metal is definitely not my area. So this was an interesting experience researching this, I was surprised by the number of what I recognize as being the American stories of the war from when I was growing up, which are very, very different from, say, the British or the Australian stories, which do, turn up in the music that the music suggestions that you sent us. But the Sergeant York turns up, which I haven't come across Sergeant York since I've been studying the war in Britain. That's very much an American myth of the war. And is it Iron Maiden's One? Is that... I was watching the video.
That's Metallica.
It's Metallica, sorry, yeah. Metallica's One. That is Johnny Got His Gun. That is the Dalton Trumbo novel set to music, essentially. But again, that's not something you come across in sort of the British myth-making of the war, the British story of the war and its cultural legacy. So it was interesting to see sort of the American influence, if you will.
But one is slightly odd because you have two separate versions. You have the music version, which doesn't have the direct references to the film, and then you've got the music video version, which has direct references from the film intercut into the song, such as for democracy, every man should give his only begotten son, and it ends with Ivan Novello's "Keep the Home Fires Burning," and they're not in the album release. So is that referring to sort of an American idea of classical republicanism, where standing up for democracy is a reason to fight, which is perhaps different to the British narrative?
I think I think the song is directly associated with the film. Even when you listen to their live performances, if you attend their live performances, they include the film snippets in their live performances. So their whole bit of what is democracy was actually sampled in one of their concerts that I saw about 4 years ago in Paris. They want that association to be direct, and they've even Metallica have bought the rights to the film so that they can use it throughout their tours. So Metallica now own the 1971 film. I don't know if they bought the rights to the book as well, or but they do own the rights to the film. But they are American, and I think the reason they chose the aftermath of war, and that's my hypothesis, I've never read any of their interviews about this or anything. The reason they chose this particular imagery of the First World War is because it fits into a larger narrative of the band. So the one single after they release One, the next single is Enter Sandman, which is another single about nightmares and feeling trapped in your own body. And I think it just fits into a wider narrative of their own struggles with addiction, with rage and anger management issues. So I don't think we're in this exclusively First World War related scenario. Warfare becomes the sort of allegory within Metallica for other things. They have this other song called The Day That Never Comes, which is about abusive relationships, about just being drawn to death, and about all of the people in the heavy metal community who have died. They had recently lost their bass player as well. So it's a song about death in general, but the video clip is about, I think, the Gulf War. I'm not an expert in uniforms or anything like that, but I think the Gulf War is easily recognizable in that video clip. So Metallica, I think, is an exception to this whole idea of recovering national myth. I don't know how well known Johnny Got His Gun is within the general public in America, but Sabaton is a whole nother story. They want to tell stories that they think are still unheard, and they're really, really good salespeople as well. So they know that they have a huge audience in the US, and therefore they've dedicated 2 songs explicitly to Sergeant York and the US Marine in their new Great War album. They know that they have a huge audience in Brazil as well, so they've dedicated a song to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in the Second World War, which even Brazilians don't know about. So they're really good at marketing, and they're really good at knowing their audience and giving their audience what they think they want and what they think they know. And they've even partnered up in the US with the people who were advocating for the construction of a First World War memorial in Washington. So before their gigs in the US, they displayed this message from this memorial fund or something, asking people to contribute to the construction of this memorial dedicated to the First World War in Washington, D.C., where apparently there was a memorial dedicated to every single war of the 20th century, apart from the First World War. Jessica, I'm sure you know more about this than I do.
Yes, I've been marched around these memorials by one of my close friends on more than one occasion and given the full lecture. There is now a First World War memorial, but yes, there's a memorial to every single 20th century conflict in Washington, and I know more about them than I really want to, I think, to be honest.
You really missed a trick during the centenary by not including Sabaton repeatedly, because they're doing a better job of public history than, well, certainly that I did.
But the peculiar thing is they're Swedish. So whose narrative of the war is a Swedish heavy metal band taking?
But it's interesting you should say that, because it's something probably for a future episode. But a surprising number of First World War computer games are made in Sweden as well.
Including one that has been made with Sabaton.
So there's... Of course it has.
They have this weird obsession with tank warfare. I don't know why. I can understand Iron Maiden's obsession with aviation, given this whole myth surrounding the Knights of the Air and whatnot. And once we get to the actual songs, I'm going to put forth another one of my hypotheses, which is that Iron Maiden's critical thinking is completely suspended whenever they're doing a song about aviation. So they're usually pretty good at balancing both acknowledging the courage of these heroes and also denouncing the futility of warfare in general, apart from when they're talking about air power. That's when they go all completely ballistic in terms of glorification. But the thing is, Sabaton have the same obsession with tank warfare, and they've designed a video game where you can choose which tank. But they have this whole vlog episode where they're designing the game, and they have this tank with the Sabaton logo next to it. So Sabaton are really all about tanks. Their drum kit is actually staged as a tank.
So several years ago, I went to see a play in the West End in London called To the Green Fields Beyond, which was about the first use of tanks in the First World War, which didn't have a real tank on stage, but a sort of artistic recreation of it. And we did end up in the bar afterwards chatting to a couple of First World War tank reenactors. So there are some interesting communities out there who are obsessed with tanks, and particularly with First World War tanks. But the idea of a drum kit set up like a tank that's a creative step further than I'd anticipated.
It's very curious, and apparently the public in the US had been asking for them to come to the US with the tank. So to put the tank in an actual airplane and fly it all the way to the US, because the public felt they were not getting the full Sabaton experience. Their drummer is actually married to the lead singer of Nightwish, and that's a band that I really love. So I was scrolling through Instagram a few years ago, and I came across her Instagram account, and apparently he gave her a t-shirt that says, "My husband has a tank," and she had a baby nephew, and he had a onesie made for her baby nephew saying, "My uncle has a tank." This whole glamour of the tank is something that I came across via heavy metal and not via the First World War community. We talk so much about this glamour of airplanes and Knights of the Air, and with it being this kind of resistance and opposition to the dehumanization of modern artillery. But the same idea being presented about a tank is something that I came across via Sabaton.
So we've talked Iron Maiden. Now the outlier for this in our list of songs we had was Motorhead, because I wasn't sure that I'd ever heard Lemmy doing anything ballady, for want of a better way of putting it. Yeah, it was an odd experience. So I was looking at what had inspired him to write it, and he'd been watching a documentary on the Somme, on the back of which he decided to write the song. So I wonder how much of the history behind the songs is actually referencing something else, a secondary source, a film or a documentary.
Now, that is something that I really wanted to explore, and it's what actually makes the link between this. I won't even call it a side project, because I haven't even transformed it into a proper project. I'm waiting to finish my thesis. But this mediation of literature and metal as a kind of tertiary source is what makes the link between my day job and the music I listen to, really. So many of these songs are inspired by books or films, even if they're not inspired by other types of art, such as Iron Maiden. I think Passchendaele is inspired by the general myth surrounding the Third Battle of Ypres. But when they do it live, Bruce Dickinson actually reads out the anthem from the Doomed Youth before they start the song. So heavy metal as a way of communicating not only what is perceived by these musicians as being the experience of war, and that's a whole other story about whether as historians we agree with their perception or not, but what is also perceived by them as being 100 years of memory of this war, and the other cultural projects associated with it is very interesting. So Iron Maiden with Anthem for the Doomed Youth, and then Sabaton have gone for Seven Pillars of Wisdom, Metallica with Trumbo. I don't know which documentary Lemmy was watching, but it could be the 1960s series of the BBC. There's so many layers of meaning that are built one upon the other. And while I can see that can be sort of problematic because we reproduce certain cliches that have been disproved already, it's also a means of education as well, in a sense. And Sabaton have really assumed for themselves this role of mediators of military history, of not as much an alternative epistemology, but a complementary epistemology of warfare. They want people to know warfare through heavy metal. They've launched a YouTube channel called Sabaton History, where they explain both their creative process, but also the battles and the deeds that are behind each of their songs. They've associated with a historian to Indiana Idol, who has his own Great War and kind of popular culture. In French, they would call it vulgarisation, which is a horror term for it. So they've associated with a military historian to explain the meaning behind their songs, and they do think that they're actually educating people and getting people to be interested in military history and telling untold stories, which is not the case with Iron Maiden. They are telling stories that everyone knows because they assume that there's a community, that there's a cultural communion between their public and their own cultural background.
With the Iron Maiden example, here's a sentence I never thought I'd say out loud. In regards to Passchendaele, is there something of the AJP Taylor about some of the Iron Maiden stuff? Because if you look at when it came out, that album was released in September 2003, which is, 5 months after the invasion of Iraq? And it's about going and dying in a pointless war far away from home in a fairly unpleasant manner.
I'd say if Afghanistan was more important from a British cultural perspective than Iraq, which is at the same time.
Yeah, quite possibly so. But is there that aspect? Is it an anti-war heavy metal song drawing on, it's using First World War language, but it isn't not necessarily talking about the First World War?
I definitely think there is. If you look at Iron Maiden's previous war songs, The Trooper or Aces High, even The Trooper could be considered an anti-war song because they're talking about the futility, they're talking about a battlefield where no one wins. But it's about the charge of the Light Brigade and the Battle of Balaclava. But they're also acknowledging the soldier as an active part of warfare, the soldier who is choosing to go towards a certain death. And then as they move into the 90s and the Gulf War, they start portraying soldiers as passive and victims, and they start talking about shell shock, for example, with Afraid to Shoot Strangers. I'm sure Jessica would have a lot to say about this particular song, which is about a soldier who feels like he cannot do his duty in the Gulf War because he is afraid to shoot strangers. And I think Passchendaele actually inscribes itself within this change of tone and change of narrative, where they're still denouncing warfare as they've always done, but they're insisting on the futility rather than on this courageous aspect. And it opens the way for their 2006 album, A Matter of Life and Death, which is all about the futility of warfare. So I think that these men are maturing in their own relation to warfare, but I also think that the expectations of the general British public with the Gulf War and then Afghanistan have contributed to this evolving narrative of the band as a whole as well.
But it's interesting that you talk about it as an evolving narrative, because of course there's the great historiographic debate within First World War studies generally about, the war as continuity with the 19th century versus this dramatic paradigm shift of Paul Fussell's "you can't have heroism without irony" after the First World War. And from that narrative that you're drawing out there, Julia, it sounds like the music of Iron Maiden very much plays into that the First World War is a war that shifts the narrative to futility, which is quite interesting given the amount of sort of looking back. And I wanted to go back and pick up on Angus's point about Motorhead's 1916, because what struck me listening to that, it's not just ballad-like, it is musically, it is hugely reminiscent of traditional military music. And the closest comparator I have, and this tells you something about my music taste, is there's an album that I have by a folk musician called Sam Sweeney. It's called Made in the Great War. So Sam Sweeney found a fiddle that was unmade but had been cut and labeled 1915, I think, and learned the history of how it had then been put together after the war by another fiddle maker. But the man who had actually cut the pieces, who had made it originally, had died in 1917 as a volunteer. So Sam Sweeney's then written this entire album about the fiddle using his folk tradition, which includes very reminiscent music, music that was very reminiscent of that song 1916 that we listened to, because it is 19th century military traditional music. It's drawing on the traditions of what soldiers in the 19th century were creating as their own vernacular music. It's interesting that you can pick up the continuities, if you will, between the 19th century and the First World War, and then the way we're commemorating it, even in something like heavy metal. So, sorry, I've gone down a complete rabbit hole there. My apologies.
The album's The Unfinished Violin.
I think it's very interesting because you talk about how changing or incorporating a new instrument can make the music more nostalgic and more reminiscent. And Lemmy himself talks about the importance of the cello for that song. He doesn't go back as far as the 19th century, but he does say that he looks at how the Beatles have incorporated the cello into Eleanor Rigby and how that inspired him. It goes back to my first point about why is there such a link between heavy metal and warfare? Is it the instruments? Is it the fact that there's this quality in the combination of a lead guitar and then a bass and a drum kit that makes it appropriate for describing a certain soundscape of war? And then with the First World War, how do we describe a soundscape that we've never had access to? It's a whole other story. But Lemmy talks about the importance of the cello for that song. And I think that's what makes it nostalgic. But most of all, the fact that it's so exceptional. I'm not sure if, Jessica, if you've listened to the rest of Motorhead to get a feel.
A couple of things. I was aware of just how much of an outlier it is.
It is. It's impressive. The thing is, Lemmy was himself very interested in military history. So I think it was a conscious effort. He collected Second World War German memorabilia, which wasn't without controversy, but he actually wore some of it on stage. He was very famous for his Iron Cross on stage as well. But people used to ask him, why do you collect Nazi memorabilia? And he said, I just think their uniforms were cool. So that's a whole nother story for a whole nother podcast. But in terms of the instruments, I think that you see that very well with Iron Maiden as well. And in terms of also the First World War as a breach in continuity, because when you listen to The Trooper and when you listen to Aces High and then you listen to Passchendaele, you don't have to know anything about military history to know that they're three very different conducts of war, and that the only one where you cannot discern an element of courage and heroism without irony is Passchendaele. This is a heavy metal band playing with silences to describe an ironic conduct of war. So you don't have to know anything about military history. And growing up in Brazil and starting to listen to Iron Maiden in Brazil with people who didn't know anything about military history, they picked up on that as well. That Aces High was about an airplane, The Trooper was about a horse, but Passchendaele, we don't really know what that is about. Why are there these moments of silence and these bursts of drums? Why is it so melancholy? Why is it so nostalgic?
Is there a reason as well that it's spelt wrong as the title track?
No idea. I know that the spelling of Passchendaele has been an element of discussion between Flemish populations and then French populations as well, and then the Anglophone way of spelling it. I have no idea why they've spelt it the way they have.
It's a little snapshot into the way I approach heavy metal music. Oh, their grammar's not right. Not going to get any marks with that spelling, boyo.
So how much are some of these songs allegories for what is actually happening at the time? I started to make a note of the dates of the songs. So Metallica's One is 1988, and surrounding that, you've got all the Vietnam films coming out. Platoon's 1988, Full Metal Jacket's 1987, Hamburger Hill's 1987. You've got Motorhead with 1916, was released in 1991, which is Gulf War One. Iron Maiden's Passchendaele is 2003, and I guess we've already mentioned Afghanistan and Iraq. So there seems to be a sort of link with when these songs come out and what is going on at the same time around them.
I think with the end of the centenary, at least the centenary effect will die down. So we won't have something like Sabaton's The Great Tour again. Not sure how I feel about that because I missed the tour. So I'm not really able to talk about it, because one of the things that really interests me is a bit of autoethnography as well, and how do I behave in a concert where they're talking about the First World War on stage. They have the whole stage set up for the First World War, and I'm trying not to analyse the discourse and the narrative of the First World War they're trying to put forward. I'm also not trying to analyse the fact that the first time I saw Sabaton was Download Festival 2015, and the people around me had just been listening to a whole hour of baby metal. I will let you find out for yourselves what that is. And then all of a sudden, Sabaton comes on stage and everything changes. The aura of masculinity, which is already very present in the Heavy Metal Festival, changed all of a sudden. Flags just shot up. I was in France, so Brittany flags and Normandy flags and fighting with each other, people wearing kilts. So I was gutted to miss their great tour, which was 100% dedicated to the First World War. But I think with the end of the centenary, it will die down a bit. I'm not sure whether these bands will find anything new to say, really.
Can I just ask, sort of following on a little bit from that, because it's sort of come up in some of your comments already, Julia, is there a real difference as a listener from hearing this music as a recording in whatever form, whether it's YouTube or a personal download or whatever, versus seeing it live? And how does that affect the way you think you relate to these narratives that are being produced? Because that discussion of the experience of being in an audience listening to their music would seem to change your relationship with the narrative, particularly around warfare.
For me, there definitely is. These bands, and as I said, the bands I've shown you are really some of the biggest heavy metal bands. So they have a lot of money and they can put a lot of money into production, and they're great storytellers. So it's not just about the music. You can't say that you go to a heavy metal concert only for the music. First of all, there's a whole staging element of it. And I think that a song like One will still sound desperate and will still be a song about body horror and about feeling trapped in your own body. But without the First World War imagery, it does lose a lot. I've never seen Passchendaele played live, but I've seen it on the DVD. The way they try to reproduce not only the soundscape, but also the lights, and then there's a silence, and you hear Bruce Dickinson's voice with him saying the first lines of Anthem for Doomed Youth. It changes it. And I think there's also the element of community in concerts. And maybe that's because I grew up in Brazil, where heavy metal is not at all a mainstream genre, even if we do have a huge fan base But not only that, I grew up in an area of Brazil where heavy metal was not only not listened to, but it was actually frowned upon. So I grew up in the northeast of Brazil. So the heavy metal, not only as music, but as a quote unquote lifestyle, was always more embraced in the southern part of Brazil, where I moved to afterwards. So I think there's also this element of a community between people in the audience, but also between the audience and the people on stage, which is a whole nother aspect of Iron Maiden digging into traditional tropes surrounding the First World War. They expect their audience to share these tropes as well, which isn't always the case. So seeing these songs live, because these bands have so much money that they can invest on the storytelling quality of their concerts, is a different experience to just listening to them. And for example, Sabaton is a band I didn't care for at all just by listening to their albums. In fact, I remember saying I refused to go to their concerts. I was at uni getting myself a degree in war studies, and I said I'm not going to pay to attend a concert where they're playing about whatever it is I was studying for 13 hours in the library the day before. I'm not going to do that. And then when I saw them live in a festival, that's when I realised that, okay, maybe their music is not my favourite, but there is something there that should be talked about and should be studied from a historian's and especially an anthropologist's perspective. Why does this have this effect on the people surrounding me and on me as well? I didn't care for them, and now I do.
I was basically going to ask almost exactly that. Do you approach these with like dual identities? Are you a heavy metal fan who's a First World War historian, or are you a First World War historian who's a heavy metal fan? And are you able to appreciate these without ruining the other for you? So do you have to kind of turn off half of your head when you listen to some of this stuff, or?
I think I'm lucky enough that I'm an anthropologist. So I've learned to deal with this, okay, where do I start and where does my work start from the first days of my undergrad, because we were trained to do ethnography. So I have the habit of always having a little book on me so that I can take notes. I think I always have the anthropologist brain turned on, and it would be impossible for me to turn it off during a concert. But I also think that it is important to let myself go with it during a concert and appreciate the music and just have this moment of basically suspension of any sort of critical thinking so that I can fully appreciate the experience and then reflect critically on it. So there are many things that I used to listen to unrelated to the First World War, but things that I used to listen to and that growing up, but then when I became an anthropologist and then later a historian, I started to see how problematic they were, especially with regards to how misogyny seems to be universal in heavy metal. It's atrocious. So I stopped listening to certain things. I still listen to others while seeing how problematic they can be. But my approach to heavy metal, even before I started looking at it as a potential object of study, was always that I like what I like and I don't like what I don't like, and I don't always know why I like something and I don't like something else. So it's very hard to get me to change my mind. But for example, System of a Down kind of happened the other way around. I didn't used to like them, and then I saw their 2015 concert in Armenia commemorating the Armenian genocide and asking Turkey to recognise it as a genocide. And that kind of changed my view on them. And then I started appreciating their music. So I do approach it with this dual perspective. It does go both ways. And especially the lyrics, it's very hard not to read a lyric as if you were reading a poem. So that's where I'm most critical of heavy metal, and that's where my day job really invades my perception of music, is because I listen to these lyrics and sometimes I just ask myself, can't they count syllables? Can't they count feet? There's something wrong there. So that's where my criticism falls mainly.
Well, I'm sure we've introduced people to some new songs. I wonder if we could set up a World War I Spotify playlist.
There's already a Spotify playlist of First World War songs, not particularly heavy metal, and it doesn't include all of the songs I've sent you. I think it came out before Sabaton's new album, but yes, I could definitely come up with a playlist. But I was trying to expand my horizons for this podcast, and some of the things are really just really, really bad. They're poorly recorded. Even with Sabaton, I mean, they're a nice band, I like them, but I think sometimes there's this dissociation between what they're trying to explore in terms of music and the story they're trying to tell. As a historian, sometimes I cringe a little when you hear, what strikes me the most is clips of Gallipoli where they have this like Queen-like keyboards, and at the same time they're talking about blood-stained sand. So that's one of the problems with heavy metal and warfare in general. It can quickly become very, very distasteful. So I could come up with a playlist for that, or I could just link you to the other playlist. But what good would that do to your reputation as a podcast? I'm not sure.
Well, the question is, so who should Jessica be booking for the next Society Conference entertainment if we could only have one? Definitely.
And I say this as a completely not interested party at all, Iron Maiden. In fact, I'd love to get some more insight into their creative process. So Steve Harris, if you're listening to this, give me a call.
He almost certainly will be. Everybody is.
I was going to say, if you can come up with the budget, I'll see what we can do about booking them. I was going to ask something similar to Chris. So in classic Desert Island style, if you could choose only one song, heavy metal song, about the First World War, which would it be?
I really, really like One by Metallica, not necessarily for its representation of the First World War, but just for how evocative it is of the sense of despair. And then when you look into the biography of each individual member of the band, but the band as a whole as well, you can see all of the nuances in there of why they've chosen the First World War and what they're trying to communicate. The mediation via film and literature, which is something that interests me as a scholar as well. So probably One by Metallica. But currently, I've caught myself listening to, on repeat, the new version of a Sabaton song that they've recorded with Apocalyptica. It's a song about trench warfare in general, and I don't like the original version, but Apocalyptica is this band where they have 3 cellos and a drum kit, and they play heavy metal using only 3 cellos and a drum kit. And they've solved all of the problems with the original song, because now it's just so melodic and it's gorgeous. So probably One by Metallica, but with Angels Calling as a pretty strong contender.
Very good. Thank you, Julia. So, Chris, what are we looking at next time out? Is it Babylon Berlin, or are we looking at Peaky Blinders?
I think it's... I'll actually answer that in a manner that can go in the podcast. I think it's Peaky Blinders, isn't it? Is it Emma Hanna next week?
I'm just looking at my schedule. I've got Hillary next week and Emma the week after.
Ah, so we've got Babylon Berlin next.
Shall I say that again in a more authoritative term? That's a great question, Angus. I'm pretty sure the next time we'll be talking about Babylon Berlin and its representations of the First World War.
So there we go. Our homework for the next month is Babylon Berlin. Thank you, Julia, for joining us.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
I enjoyed that very much. And I guess that's all from us for now. So thank you, Chris and Jessica. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Oh, what a lovely war.